On the 5th of April, 1976, a small private jet made an emergency descent toward a hospital in Houston, Texas, carrying a passenger so severely deteriorated that the flight crew radioed ahead requesting a stretcher and a full medical team on the tarmac. By the time the plane touched down, the passenger was already dead. He weighed roughly 90 pounds. His hair and fingernails had grown to a length that made him almost unrecognizable as a modern human being, let alone as any specific person. Doctors at the hospital could not immediately confirm who he was. In the end, it was the FBI who settled the question, running his fingerprints against records on file because the man's own face no longer offered enough certainty on its own. The fingerprints came back and confirmed what almost no one in the room could quite believe. This was Howard Hughes, at that moment reckoned among the richest private citizens the United States had ever produced, and the authorities needed a federal fingerprint database to prove it. Here is the detail that makes his story different from every other fortune in this series. Every other founder we have covered built something, however flawed, meant to outlast them. A will, a trust, a holding company, a foundation, even a deliberate refusal to build anything at all, the way Andrew Carnegie chose. Howard Hughes did none of it. When lawyers finally opened the safe, expected to hold his final wishes, there was no valid will inside, nothing. A man who had once controlled an airline, a movie studio, a chain of casinos, and an aerospace company worth billions simply never got around to deciding, on paper, what should happen to any of it. So before we go further, the question worth sitting with is not how did Howard Hughes lose his fortune? He never lost a dollar of it in any conventional sense. The question is stranger than that. How does the richest man in America die with no plan at all, and what fills that vacuum when nobody, including the man himself, ever bothered to answer it? To understand how he arrived at that plane in 1976, you have to go back to a Texas oil field decades earlier, because nobody handed Howard Hughes his fortune either, at least not directly. It was built first by his father. Howard Hughes Sr. was a lawyer turned wildcat prospector who ran into the single most common problem in the early oil business, drill bits that shattered against hard rock formations almost as fast as they were lowered into the ground. In 1908, he patented a two-cone rotary drill bit capable of chewing through rock that had stopped every earlier design cold, and rather than sell the invention outright, he did something that would define the family's fortune for the next half-century. He refused to sell the bit itself. He only ever leased it, charging oil companies a fee for every foot it drilled, keeping the design, the manufacturing, and the underlying patent entirely in his own hands. It was a machine with a built-in toll booth, not unlike the choke point instincts that built the Vanderbilt and Ford fortunes earlier in this series, and it made Hughes Tool Company one of the most quietly profitable businesses in the country, essential to nearly every oil well drilled in America without most people ever learning the company's name. Then, in January of 1924, Howard Hughes Sr. collapsed and died of a heart attack in his office, still a relatively young man. His son, Howard Hughes Jr., was 18 years old. Here is where the story could have gone the same direction as half the fortunes already covered in this series, fragmenting immediately among a crowd of relatives with competing claims. Instead, the 18-year-old did something that echoes the Commodore Vanderbilt's instinct almost exactly. Within a year, using a Texas court ruling that declared him a legal adult early specifically so he could act, young Hughes bought out the minority shares held by his aunt and uncle and became the sole owner of Hughes Tool Company outright. One heir, total concentration, no fragmentation at all. It should have been the strongest possible foundation this series has ever documented, and for a while, it was. With total control of a business that threw off enormous, steady cash regardless of what he did with his time, young Hughes did something almost no other founder in this series ever had the freedom to do. He left the machine to run itself under professional management back in Texas, and he went looking for something to spend his restless energy on instead. He found several. He moved to Hollywood and financed motion pictures, personally producing and directing extravagant, expensive films, at one point building a private air force of vintage aircraft purely to stage the aerial battle sequences in a single movie about the First World War. He set multiple world speed records himself at the controls, flying custom aircraft he had commissioned to be faster than anything the United States military itself possessed. In 1938, he flew around the entire world in under 4 days, a genuine sensation that made him a household name far beyond the oil fields that had funded it all. He founded an aircraft manufacturing company. He acquired a controlling interest in a struggling airline that would become Trans World Airlines and helped turn it into one of the dominant carriers crossing the Atlantic. By the middle of the 20th century, Howard Hughes was not one businessman. He was simultaneously an aviator, a film mogul, an industrialist, and an airline baron, and the public could not get enough of watching him do all four at once. That reputation nearly came apart in public, in a Senate hearing room, in the summer of 1947. During the war, Hughes had accepted tens of millions of dollars in government contracts to build a fleet of reconnaissance aircraft and an enormous wooden flying boat originally intended to ferry troops across the Atlantic without risking German submarines. By the time the war ended, almost none of it had actually flown. A Senate subcommittee, suspecting the money had gone toward Hughes's own extravagant lifestyle rather than any working aircraft, summoned him to Washington to explain himself under oath in front of newsreel cameras and a packed public gallery. It was the closest thing to a Homestead-style reckoning this story ever produces, a moment where the machine's builder was forced to answer, in person, for how the money had actually been spent. Hughes did not simply defend himself quietly. He counterattacked, accusing the subcommittee's chairman of running the investigation as a personal vendetta on behalf of a rival airline, and turned the hearing into a public spectacle that the newspapers covered for days. Then, that November, with the hearing still fresh in the public's memory, Hughes personally climbed into the cockpit of the enormous wooden aircraft the Senate had mocked as too heavy to ever leave the water, and flew it himself, low over a harbor, for barely a minute, in front of witnesses and photographers he had specifically invited. The flight covered less than a mile and never rose more than a few dozen feet above the waves. It never needed to prove the aircraft was practical. It only needed to prove Hughes had been telling the truth, and it worked. The hearings quietly closed without further consequence. It is one of the last moments in this story where Hughes appears entirely in command of his own narrative, standing in front of cameras rather than hiding from them, and it is worth remembering because almost nothing that follows it will look anything like this again. Here is where his story begins to develop its own strange logic, distinct from anything the fairness paradox produced in earlier episodes of this series. Hughes never married in a way that produced children. He had relationships and one significant marriage to an actress that ended in divorce years before his death, but there was no son groomed to inherit the way William Henry Vanderbilt or Henry Ford II had been. Unlike Andrew Carnegie, who faced a single obvious heir and made a deliberate, principled choice to withhold the bulk of his fortune from her, Hughes simply never had a comparable heir to withhold anything from in the first place, and more importantly, he never made any comparable decision about anyone. Carnegie's fortune vanished from his family by design, in writing, argued out over pages of a published essay. Hughes's fortune would eventually vanish from any coherent family structure for the opposite reason entirely. Nobody ever asked him to decide, and the one time it truly mattered, he was no longer capable of deciding anything at all. Because somewhere in the years after the Second World War, something in Howard Hughes began to change, slowly enough that almost nobody around him could pinpoint the exact moment it became serious. He had survived 2 catastrophic aircraft crashes personally testing experimental planes, and the injuries and the codeine prescribed for the pain appear to have compounded a mind already prone to obsessive, compulsive behavior. He grew fixated on contamination, on germs, on the precise sequencing of ordinary tasks. He began issuing written memos to his own staff detailing exactly how a can of peaches should be opened before it could be brought anywhere near him. In 1966, he sold his entire stake in Trans World Airlines, forced out after a long legal battle with the airline's own board over his refusal to disclose how he intended to finance new aircraft purchases, and walked away with a check for roughly $546 million, one of the largest single personal paydays in American history to that point. It should have been the beginning of a triumphant final act. Instead, Hughes took that enormous sum of liquid cash, moved into the top floor of a Las Vegas hotel called the Desert Inn, and when the hotel's management eventually asked their strange, reclusive, endlessly paying guest to vacate the penthouse for the paying holiday season, Hughes responded by simply buying the entire hotel outright rather than leave the room. That purchase became the template for the rest of his life. Move into a hotel penthouse, buy the hotel if anyone tries to make him leave, draw the curtains. He acquired a string of casinos and hotels along the Las Vegas Strip over the following years, becoming, without ever once appearing in public to do it, one of the most powerful men in Nevada, his casinos generating enormous cash flow that nobody around him fully understood how to account for, because increasingly nobody around him ever saw him at all. He moved from penthouse to penthouse across several countries in his final decade: the Bahamas, London, Nicaragua, Mexico, always accompanied by a small, tightly controlled circle of aides who managed nearly every aspect of his physical existence, feeding him, monitoring him, and increasingly making decisions on his behalf that he himself no longer seemed capable of making. Reports from those final years describe a man confined largely to a darkened room, watching the same films repeatedly, subsisting on a severely restricted diet, his physical health deteriorating in ways his own aides were reportedly too frightened of him or too dependent on him to intervene against. And through all of it, the one document that should have existed, the one piece of paper that could have told the world what Howard Hughes wanted done with an estate eventually estimated at somewhere between $1 and $2 billion, was never produced. When he died on that airplane in 1976, lawyers searched everywhere a will might reasonably be kept. They found nothing valid. What they found instead, months later, was stranger than fiction. A handwritten document surfaced claiming to be Hughes's genuine last will, leaving a portion of the fortune to a Nevada gas station attendant who claimed the eccentric billionaire had once collapsed in the desert near his station and that he had given the stranded man a ride into town, a small act of kindness the will supposedly repaid with millions of dollars. The document became known across the country as the Mormon Will. After another portion of the estate it claimed to direct toward a religious institution, a jury examined the handwriting, the timeline, and the sheer implausibility of the story, and in 1978 ruled the document a forgery. The gas station attendant received nothing. The search for a genuine will continued, and none was ever found. With no valid will anywhere, the state stepped in and applied the plain, mechanical rules of intestate succession, the same cold arithmetic that determines where a fortune goes when its owner leaves no instructions at all. Because Hughes had no surviving spouse, no children, and no living parents or siblings, the courts worked outward through the family tree until they landed on the only category of relative left standing: first cousins. 22 of them, scattered across the country, most of whom had never met their famous relative, some of whom likely could not have picked him out of a photograph taken any time in the previous 30 years. After years of legal wrangling to sort out exactly how the estate should be divided among them, an estate this size finally splintered, not because a family fought over it, and not because a founder decided it should, but because nobody had ever bothered to decide anything, and the law itself was forced to draw the family tree for him. The chaos did not stop at deciding who the heirs were. It extended to deciding which state even had the right to tax them, because Hughes had spent his final years drifting between hotel penthouses in Nevada, California, Texas, and beyond, without ever settling anywhere long enough to establish a clear, undisputed legal residence. 3 separate states each opened their own probate proceedings, and each claimed the right to collect inheritance tax on an estate worth well over $1 billion. Texas argued he had never truly abandoned the state of his birth. California argued he had lived and worked there for decades and quietly maintained residences within its borders. Nevada argued that the hotels he had bought rather than vacate were, by any reasonable definition, his actual home. Lawyers for the eventual heirs spent years fighting a war on 3 separate fronts simultaneously, arguing in one courtroom that Hughes had lived in a state, while arguing in another courtroom on the very same facts that he had not, whichever position happened to reduce the total tax bill in that particular jurisdiction. It was eventually resolved through a coordinated settlement dividing the tax liability among the 3 states. But the sheer fact that the richest man in America could die without anyone, including 3 separate state governments, agreeing on which state he had actually lived in, tells you almost everything you need to know about how completely he had let every ordinary structure of an ordinary life dissolve around him. Now, here is the twist that separates this story from a simple tragedy of neglect, and it is worth holding on to because it changes everything about how you should read the ending. 2 decades before his death, in 1953, Hughes had done one deliberate, structural thing with a piece of his empire, though at the time it had almost nothing to do with generosity. He transferred ownership of Hughes Aircraft Company, one of his most valuable holdings, into a newly created nonprofit medical research organization called the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. On paper, the institute now owned the aircraft company outright. In practice, Hughes retained total operational control over the business, running it exactly as he always had, while the nonprofit structure shielded enormous sums from taxation and gave him a convenient legal shelter from scrutiny he badly wanted to avoid. It was not philanthropy in the way Carnegie meant the word. It was closer to a tax strategy, wearing a white coat, but structures, once built, do not always stay loyal to the selfish reasons they were built for. When Hughes Aircraft Company was finally sold in 1985, nearly a decade after his chaotic, will-less death, the sale brought in something in the neighborhood of $5 billion. And because of the ownership structure Hughes had set up in 1953 for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine or charity, nearly the entire sum flowed directly into the endowment of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, rather than into the hands of 22 distant cousins or the swirl of lawyers fighting over his estate. Today, the institute Hughes built as a tax dodge is one of the best-funded private biomedical research organizations on Earth, having funded work connected to multiple Nobel Prizes in medicine, supporting scientists studying everything from genetics to infectious disease, with an endowment that dwarfs almost every other charitable foundation named for an individual American. The one piece of paperwork Howard Hughes ever signed with anything resembling long-term structural intention, built for reasons as cold and self-interested as anything the Commodore Vanderbilt or the Bush family patriarchs ever did, turned out to be the only part of his fortune that would go on to matter for anyone beyond his own lifetime. Everything else, the casinos, the airline stock, the personal cash, the aircraft manufacturing patents, the accumulated wealth of a man once counted among the richest in the country, dissolved into a legal scramble among cousins who had never known him, settled over years of courtroom argument, taxed and divided, and eventually spent down into the ordinary, unremarkable lives of people who happened to share his blood by an accident of genealogy rather than any relationship he ever chose. There is no Hughes dynasty today. There was never enough structure left standing to call it one. What endures instead carries a different name entirely, attached to laboratories and research grants rather than casinos or film studios, built by a man who could not manage to leave a single page of instructions for the fortune he actually meant to control, but who had, without noticing it, already built the one machine that would outlive him anyway. So think back to that runway in Houston in 1976, and the federal agents pulling fingerprint records to confirm the identity of a man once recognized on sight by half the country. The richest private citizen in America died so isolated, so unwitnessed, that proving who he even was required forensic evidence rather than a single living person's word. He built airplanes that flew around the world in days. He built a fortune that touched oil, film, aviation, and gambling all at once. And at the very end, the only thing he ever built that reliably survived him was the one document he never meant as a gift to anyone at all.